After months of speculation, the European Commission has finally come up with firm proposals on how the EU might pay its way in the future.
Robin Hood, riding through the glen.
The idea of a tax on financial activity around the world is one supported by most people in the EU, according to a poll commissioned by the European Parliament and published this week. With no agreement globally, the poll suggests people would support a tax of this kind on an EU level, for the time being at least. Most MEPs have recorded their backing for the idea too, and this week it got further credence as the European Commission unveiled its plans on how the EU should be financed from 2014. In its 7-year budget plan, the Commission says the idea of a financial transaction tax, along with an EU VAT, should be considered.
Taxing more risky financial operation, probably with privilege for regulated markets also, it could increase the share of own resources up to more than 40%.
Many of Europe's national governments are struggling with debt, committed to strict austerity at home. Led by Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron, some of them want an equivalent freeze on EU spending. To some extent, this has been acknowledged in this week's proposals. But the European Commission wants to break the EU's heavy reliance on national contributions for its funding. The plan for EU taxes is one way to get there. It's highly political stuff, but with this week's announcement, the debate has begun in earnest.
Well, I'm joined now by 3 members of the European Parliament to talk about the proposals from the Commission. We have Rebecca Harms, who is a German MEP and who is also the co-president of the European Greens here at the Parliament. Nigel Farage, the UK Independence Party's leader, who also is co-president of the Europe of Freedom and Democracy at the Parliament, and Graham Watson, a British Liberal Democrat MEP. Graham, let me ask you first of all, this idea of a financial transaction tax, Tobin tax, Robin Hood tax, whatever you want to call it, it's an idea that the European Commission once ruled out and now seem to be favouring among others. Do you think they're right to look at this again as an option?
Well, I think there are many of us who were sceptical of the idea when it was first launched, but the more we've looked at it, have actually begun to think that actually this might not be a bad way of doing things. At the moment, every 5 years, you have the most appalling 6 to 8 months of horse trading between countries about who's going to pay how much, who will get how much back. It's not very helpful to the smooth functioning of the European Union. And if we were able to identify a tax that would raise about the amount of money you need to run the thing, then why not go for it?
But if the logic didn't work then, why should it work now?
The logic works then, but people were very doubtful about the impact of a financial transaction tax, what it would do. Would it in any way calm down the market? The Swedes have run a financial transaction tax. It has worked very well.
They argue it worked very badly, actually, but anyway.
And they haven't got a financial sector.
Of course they've got a financial sector that's much smaller.
Nigel, you're one of those who argue that it would actually not work well. Why?
Well, I think there are 2 things to say here. Firstly, let's just remember that this is the EU moving towards direct taxation for the first time. So it's important to put it in context. They want to raise their own money, which is, of course, the basic function of a state. When it comes to financial transaction tax, or for that matter, many green taxes that the EU puts in place, it seems to forget there's a bigger world out there. So almost by definition, if unilaterally the EU goes for a financial transaction tax, you will find that insurance business and foreign exchange business and commodity business and genuine business that industry needs to survive and go on will move to Zurich and to Bermuda and to America and to Singapore. So that's the first reason why I think it's a very bad idea. And secondly, we have to remember that the financial centre of the European Union is London. We are the only global financial centre in the whole of the EU, and I can see the smile on Rebecca's face. There are many here in this place that hate Britain, hate the Anglo-Saxon culture. They all openly, even the Commissioner Barnier says they want to attack the Anglo-Saxon culture. They love to see London being hurt. It isn't in our interest.
Is that why Germany and France have backed this idea, Rebecca?
So at first, I love London, I love the parks, I love the gardens, so I'm a gardener, therefore don't talk about hate, etc.
What about the business?
So the business is a problem. And the business, the financial business, not only in London but in Europe and globally, is a problem and created this big financial crisis we are still in because we have not enough rules put on this part of the business. And this is, I would say, the discussion where we have to speak also about the financial transaction tax.
You have to be very
It's one
clear,
of the...
don't you, that this is not a punishment. We're not talking about this as a punishment towards the banks, but a way of raising money.
But this is not just banks, is it? Come on. This is not just banks that we're going to
also about
attack here. We're
insurances.
talking about a broader
Yes,
financial business.
financial sector. And what I think is crucial if we are, and why we are supporting the financial transaction tax since a long time, is we need to fulfill two targets. So first, we have to calm the markets. The hunger for big profits in the financial sector is very, very big. And so I think the tax could bring down a little bit this hunger for huge and fast profits. Secondly, I would say it's not punishment, it's only fair. That the financial sector participates in the solutions of the crisis. So we need a financial contribution also from this sector to pave the way out of the crisis. So Greece, for example, Spain, Portugal, maybe also the UK once, will need financial support.
Look, in the United Kingdom, the financial sector contributes to the UK economy just shy of 20% of all of our tax revenues. We want, in the United Kingdom, to have a healthy, well-regulated financial sector. Your comment about banks and the cause of the crisis and the politicians that allowed the banks to do what they did are entirely justified. But let's not crucify our genuine financial transaction business for that reason.
Graham, let's hear from Graham.
We're not talking only about taxing the City of London. We're talking about a financial transaction tax across the EU. Now, there are many ways, there are many kinds of taxes you could conceivably raise to finance what we need to spend at European Union level. But some of the taxes are easier to collect than others, some of them are easier to police than others. The financial transaction tax is one that is relatively easy to police and collect, that might have an effect of calming the markets and stopping the worst of the kind of speculative trades that we saw at the height of boom just before the whole thing collapsed 2 years ago.
Nothing of the sort.
And, well, it might. It
Nothing
might
of the
have
sort.
that effect.
If you want to execute...
it would raise the money you need.
If you want to do that business, if you're a gambler, you'll do it somewhere else. You'll do it somewhere.
And that's the reason, Graham.
I worked in this for 20 years. I was a broker for 20 years.
I worked in the city as well.
The worry about the shift, though, to elsewhere in the world is why the Commission in the past opposed this idea. That remains an issue, doesn't it?
Of course, look, any business is welcome, or is perfectly able to move from any part of the world to any other part of the world. We see it all the time. At the moment, we're having an argument with the Chinese about carbon emissions tax on airlines. That is always there. But the reality is, you've got to fund the European Union. If you don't want to have this 5-year set to among the various governments, then you've got to find an autonomous way of financing it. And that's what they're looking for. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to look at a financial transaction tax, just as it is to look at carbon taxes or others, as a way of financing the European Union.
But it sounds as if you're sort of saying, well, if it happens, it happens. I mean, you can't be that lackadaisical about it, can you?
Lackadaisical.
It would be catastrophic.
Look, Sweden introduced a financial transaction tax. It didn't lead to all the financial services companies leaving Sweden. There are many reasons why companies based
Well, we've had Gunnar Hökmark on this programme actually saying it did lead to some
But the point about transaction taxes is it affects where business is executed. You know, if you're running if you're running from Stockholm a fund management business, you know, me on behalf of you, if you're my client, may do 2 or 3 trades a year. If you're the place where business is actually executed, and that's what London does, that's what London is, it will have a disproportionate effect upon the British. It will make no difference to speculative flows of money because they'll do it through Zurich or Bermuda or elsewhere.
Whatever you say, Nigel, the fact is, though, even though the British government at the moment is opposed to this idea, there is an appetite for this. There are numerous polls recently carried out which show that the public would like to see this.
I think there's been a deliberate confusion put out by politicians that banks and financial services are all one and the same thing, and they're not. And that argument must be made.
That's true, and they're politicians like you, maybe, Rebecca.
No, but for me, especially considering the public view on this, so They want a fair contribution from the banks, the insurances, and all these finance companies. No, they are not doing it already. No, they are not doing it already. And what I would like to add at this point is we have numerous political leaders in the EU in favor of this transaction tax. And what I think it's a little bit like with the haircut. Yeah? So if they are in favor of a soft haircut, if they are in favor of financial transaction tax, they have to do it once. And the proposition of the Commission will help the EU leaders to decide.
Now, those EU leaders don't include Britain. Graham, can you see a possibility of the UK government ever going along with this, which could perhaps include giving up the rebate as well as part of the whole deal?
Well, the UK rebate is something that was actually dealt with under the Labour government, and when Tony Blair in 2005 did a deal whereby the rebate gradually goes down over the years, because we recognise that countries like Romania and Bulgaria should not end up as net payers into the European Union's budget.
But not enough, according to many people here in the Parliament.
Well, certainly there are some who argue that the rebate should be abolished altogether. I am not one of those. I think that the deal that Tony Blair struck, to give him credit for this, although many things I don't give him credit for, was actually a rather good one, and it was in Britain's interests. But I do think that Britain has to be prepared to look at how we are going to finance the European Union objectively in the longer term, and therefore it has to be prepared to look at...
But as Nigel pointed out, tax-raising powers are usually what countries do, and the EU isn't.
What if I think post the Lisbon Treaty, post the Lisbon Treaty,
1 second, Rebecca.
Post the Lisbon Treaty, everybody here, the EU leaders, are behaving as if it were now a state.
No, but since the 1970s, we have in our treaties the issue of own resources. It has been always foreseen, and I know it's a very difficult issue, but if we always increase the burdens, what the EU shall do, and are then going to decrease the finances for the EU, this is not possible. And an ongoing own resources would create a lot of stability in the EU, and I think the majority of the Parliament knows this.
The European Union has raised its own taxes, as Rebecca points out, since the 1970s. A proportion of VAT goes into funding the European Union. Proportions of trade transaction revenue come into the European Union. It's not quite the same because what we're talking about now is getting rid of the national contribution.
Indirect taxes and contributions are different to direct taxes.
Okay, well, on that note, we'll have to leave it.